session is on policy, regulation, and governance for university sustainability. My name is ASHISH Bharadwaj. I'm Dean of the Jindal School of Banking and Finance at OP Jindal Global University. We have an absolutely fantastic set of speakers for this session as well. There's a slight change though. Dr. Bhushan Patwardhan will not be joining us. There is another big conference, in fact, a conclave on transformational reforms in higher education, hosted by MHRD and UGC. In fact, Prime Minister Modi is probably addressing these issues live right now as we speak here. But thankfully, Professor Raj Kumar has kindly stepped in his place. Panelists, we have some serious competition in this session. But before we start, let me introduce the speakers of this session very quickly. Professor VIRANDER CHAUHAN, Chairman, National Assessment and Accreditation Council, NAAC in India. Professor Dr. MANISHA PRIYAM, Associate Professor, National Institute for Educational Planning and Administration, India. We are waiting for Dr. David Malone, who's Rector of United Nations University in Japan, to join us. And he will join this session as soon as he's able to get the link. Before we start, allow me to give you some context of this session in about 3 to 4 minutes before we can get started. So historically, public policies around the world have focused on ensuring institutional sustainability, along with adequately addressing the mounting global problems such as climate change, poverty, issues around access, income inequality, and so on. However, the current disruption owing to the pandemic has made it obvious that universities should foster resilience and be prepared for sudden disruptions of unprecedented nature, like the COVID crisis. Due to the ongoing health crisis, higher educational institutions, universities around the world had to implement various initiatives within a very short span of time, and they had to adjust to the new normal that was thrust upon all of us. While universities, governments, regulatory policymaking bodies have responded to the crisis in a commendable manner, the challenges of governance and regulation have further deepened due to the move towards online teaching and online learning. Questions like how to and who will now govern this space have become very, very crucial. Will the higher education space continue to be governed by the same standards, policies, and laws that were there before the COVID disruption? Will the policies that were applicable to a bricks and mortar university prove effective for the governance of virtual online learning space? The cases of Zoom bombing, with the exception of this conference, and other issues with online platforms have compelled regulators to ask the most profound question, like how to centrally regulate a space that is inherently very deregulated. How can universities sustain themselves in this new higher education model? There is therefore an urgent need to reimagine the role of regulatory bodies in the context of evolving models of university education, and with that, a need for higher education institutions and universities to evolve and transform themselves. A recent UNESCO report has identified 4 critical ways in which governments can intervene, particularly in a crisis situation. First, include higher education in the plans for economic and social recovery. Prime Minister Modi might be touching on this in his address right now. Second, forging a national consensus on a strategy for fostering recovery and innovation in higher education. Third, providing a clear regulatory environment of safety and security when reopening physical classroom spaces. And fourth, committing to international cooperation in the phase of mitigation and revival. With this, I welcome all panelists to this session. I would like to thank all the technology gods and internet goddesses for their kind support. There's one request as a moderator to this session. I request you to keep your responses brief so that we can finish on time and take up audience questions. I always do a pre-discussion poll questions for the audience when I chair or moderate any session. So some habits are hard to change, pandemic or no pandemic. To answer, participants have to just type yes or no in the chat window of YouTube where we are streaming live. And we'll do the same poll again at the end. So let's see if our illustrious panel is able to sway the public opinion. The question for the audience, for the participants, is the following. online virtual learning will outperform traditional university teaching and learning? Yes or no? I repeat, online virtual learning will outperform traditional university teaching and learning. Yes or no? Please type your yes or no response in the chat window of YouTube. Now I invite our first panelist, and on a positive note, let me get started. Professor Chauhan, I read one of your recent articles on India's pivotal role in the race to deliver vaccines, COVID vaccines globally, based on India's experience in not just the vaccine delivery on a very large scale, but also the success of our pharmaceutical industry led by private sector, but adequately supported by the state since the 1970s. Now, drawing an analogy of this with the topic of our conference and session, can COVID-19 change the model of governance of higher education? And if yes, will this change depend on whether it is a public or a private university? Professor Chauhan.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So I'll start with this. You actually very perceptively chose the example of pharma industry. Again, like in education and health, when British left, there was hardly any pharma, some very small state-owned pharma industry. And I don't want to dwell too much in the parallel of the two, but you've done a very good job of doing so because I was going to do so. So the state has hugely supported the infrastructure, even early discovery, setting up procedures, clearing up regulatory processes especially for vaccine, since we are talking about vaccine. I really think this can easily be done, and I dare say ought to be done in the field of education. I personally really, if you ask me, you really brought the discussion to a straight on the plank that's the only way to go. And we've been working, I personally have been working, and you'll see this in education policy and the last 2 weeks and next couple of weeks or 3 weeks to go into this, that how it will be necessary to even, I would go a step forward. Just start forgetting that there is a private sector and there's a public sector. Of course there will be. I mean, the physicality will be different, equity, access, all those issues will be there. But mentally, I think we should get out of that block. And I think regulatory authorities already are being nudged into the direction. For example, and I'll stop this so you can ask other questions, that is the competitive funding, research funding in private institutions or in government or so-called public institutions, there already will be no difference. And this will be announced further. If you read new education policy, it very simply said that for competitive research funding, there should be no differences made. Of course, there'll be differences, and I think that we leave for another day for discussion. The answer is robust, yes. But just to get the viewer on board on the COVID, you've seen the newspaper today, and you saw it in yesterday, Serum Institute. I have known Serum for past 30 years from a small vaccine producer. It is the biggest giant all over the world. So both Novavax vaccine, which is doing very well, and Oxford vaccine, both will be produced here. Already MOU is there. So this is where the India's future lies. I think in education 10 years from now, we should be able to say, look, these are the institutions, these are the university which you don't have to actually go and advertise. You get self-advertise. Once you bring quality, see what Serum did, what Bharat did, what others did, and we could do very easily in higher education and research, is to just create a very good quality brand. And that doesn't happen in a day. That will, in education will take 10 to 15 to 20 years. And I think I'm glad education policy talks about it. Regulators have to be flexible. Regulators have to think of deregulation. Regulation in the framework of deregulation will be the word that I'll say. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chauhan. Let me invite our second speaker. By the way, the pre-discussion audience poll result is the following. 27% of our participants feel, it said yes, that online virtual learning will outperform traditional ways of teaching and learning. Anyway, we'll do this poll again towards the end. Professor PRIYAM, you just heard what Professor Chauhan said about deregulation and flexibility. You've worked a lot on education policy, urban social protection issues. What are your thoughts? Do you think the discourse on higher education model being a global common good really makes sense now in this current context? What are your thoughts?
So I'll, grab all the 30, 40 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever you want to give me immediately and tell you that if you kind of look at the architecture of what Professor Virender Chauhan has just said, he is speaking to you in engagement with the site of the public university. He's telling us that the public university is not something that is to be characterized only by its mode of funding, and he is immersing us in the domain of knowledge. He's talking about the virus, whereas you are asking us to talk about policy, regulation, governance. He's talking about the kinds of research. So therefore, I think an important part of the lesson that I draw from Honorable Professor Virender Chauhan is that any discussion on reforms in the public university, albeit it starts with the tenets of policy, regulation, and governance, first need to be embedded in principles of knowledge. If you were to reverse this poll that you've sent as a binary, and we as knowledge practitioners understand that the binaries are one form of representation for us. So even if the entire world said, yes, we want this or that, I as a knowledge practitioner immersed in the perennial idea of the university would say that this is one format of questioning that you've got, and it's goaded people to answer this way or that. But if you were to take to them the questions that Professor Virender Chauhan is very eminently posing as the opening remarks of the panel, that first and foremost, the global common good idea of the university needs to be embedded in a body of knowledge. Did anybody know in this country that you had a man amongst ourselves called Virender Chauhan, who was playing with the serum, who was playing with the virus, when our country and our public policies were at best geared to deal with the bacteria? So do you understand that one part of looking at our policy terrain, our life as a democracy, is the invention of the penicillin and the health of the masses? We did it with the bacteria. Can we now do it with the virus? Now, this question has come to us today. Eminent scientists like Professor Virender Chauhan have spent their lives traversing the domain of the public university and discovering that virus that we did not know about. So in a sense, I would say that, the digital is a format, just as the palm leaf was a format. Will you do a poll saying, should we go to the palm leaf format of the paper? That was also a format. Do you know that the hieroglyphics, for example, were carried all the way? Those granite structures have been carried from Greece, and they lie today as colonial repositories of knowledge in the British Museum. You know why? Because you needed somebody to decode the Rosetta Stone. So the perennial concerns of the university are beyond questions that seem to tell you that there is a closure of ideas on what policy is, there's a closure of ideas on what governance is. No, these closure of ideas happen when we only listen to underpopulated concepts of either policy or regulation and governance. And therefore, I would begin to engage with this panel, an eminent panel, in its presence and in its absence, with the last part of your idea, which is the idea of university sustainability. And I think the crisis today is not the crisis of policy or regulation or governance, good, bad, or ugly. This country did a lot with its university space. And remember, some of its finest institutions have been set up when the British only had a utilitarian mandate for us, when the British only wanted to control our exam papers and levy, just like they levied the farmer with the peasantry fees, they levied the exam fees through the universities. And people in Jadunath Sarkar, Professor Jadunath Sarkar, is talking about the chakri. And the university became a site of chakri, which is joblessness. But there were other eminent people, and those eminent people happened to be a man called Madan Mohan Malviya. Those eminent people happened to be a man called the Mysore Maharaja. Those eminent people happened to be a man called the Maharaja of Baroda. Backwards. Now they said that, look, one part of our struggle against the British is political, the other part is a knowledge struggle. And even in the 1930s, I have said it many times, that India embraced internationalism as a principle. Globalization was not a word then, but can you imagine that on ships, some of our most eminent academics and scientists were sent by these university leaders to connect with universities abroad, whether it was Oxford, University of Chicago, Australian universities, Thomas Denham, C.R. Reddy. They traveled to ask them, how did you build the best universities? And none less than Professor Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore said, where the mind is without fear. Now, these ideas are perpetual. These ideas could be Socratic. These ideas could be the eminent philosopher of science at my alma mater, the London School of Economics, Karl Popper, who says there's no certitude to knowledge. It's certain only to the extent that the next one will falsify all existing plans. And therefore, today, I would say, in conclusion, two eminent points that I can see are being made by Virender S. CHAUHAN, but which I also gather in my discussions with Professor Bhushan Patwardhan, who's not here right now, that we need to look at our universities in their existing form, in their existing quotidian forms. And don't dismiss the life of the Indian public universities as something which is third rate, which can never become world class. Those that we consider third rate today, after I came back from the LSE, I decided to walk the landscape of India to see its university diversity. Even a university in Jabalpur, Rani Durgavati Vishwavidyalaya, has a physics lab where an eminent scientist and Meghnad Saha and Hargobind Khorana participated in physics labs. So for me, the idea of policy, governance, and regulation is something that must talk about university sustainability. The university first must become a domain of knowledge, a domain of dialogue. The scientist called Virender S. CHAUHAN must meet the eminent sociologists, the eminent social scientists. Much of what the university will generate for its sustainability will not be through new governance mechanisms, but through great dialogues which are churned only in the domain of the university, when an eminent virologist talks to someone who's done the bacteria, and who talks to someone who understands how the labor has suffered the most because of this pandemic. So the great debates will make for the perennial sustainability of the university. And I conclude by saying that the university in India, more than anywhere else, must respond to the human condition. And I would say with pride today that our university makers have had a conception of the university since the time that they fought with the colonial masters. And that's the perennial idea of the Indian university that I subscribe and say that it must be upheld today by all forums and all discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Priyam. Very well said. I completely endorse your views on confluence of ideas and how India embraced internationalism and this kind of an important dialogue. Let me turn to Professor Rajkumar. Professor Raj, you heard what Professor CHAUHAN and Professor Priyam had to say. I'll take it one step ahead. Do you think we needed a global pandemic to bring about these kinds of concrete changes in governance as we are seeing today in higher education? Dr. Kumar.
Thank you very much, Ashish, for that. Well, let me say this, that there has been a continuum of efforts and reform initiatives that the higher education system has been pursuing. Clearly, the pandemic should not be a wake-up call for us to do what we are doing, but I think it is only fair to say that these voices have been emerging for a while. And I think one of the big challenges of a higher education system, at least in the Indian context, is that it has several actors and several stakeholders, and decision-making cannot be and need not be, is not easy. But in fact, it's as much as we, quibble about the Indian, challenges with regard to regulation and governance, the problems around the world is not very dissimilar. Higher education has been historically seen to be in a particular way, and most universities tend to operate in a particular method. And once there are externalities like the ones that we are facing today, they end up reimagining. For example, I'll give you two examples. If you look at the current crisis, the universities which are, let's say, significantly dependent upon international students, for example, for their revenues, are dramatically or adversely affected in a significant manner. And I think it'll take years, if not more than a decade, for them to recover. Second thing is that universities which are significantly dependent upon, STEM-based disciplines, but also significant resources for investment in laboratories and things like that. The private sector investment, including, are also going to take some more time. So in a way, it's also a call for universities to become more responsible of their identity, but also conscious of the fact that they need to be dynamically evolving. And in that sense, regulation should meet that expectation and aspiration. And I do think that some of the impact that we're facing today is here to stay. I think blended learning is going to become more and more acceptable and normal. A lot of resources could actually be usefully spent on other things that universities do. I also think that the classroom experience, which all of us value more physically, should be there, particularly in undergraduate education. But a lot of professional education, including graduate education, need not be entirely based upon the brick and mortar campus idea. Those are the type of regulatory reforms that this pandemic is particularly going to drive.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kumar. I want to bring Professor Chauhan here. Professor Chauhan, you heard what both the speakers had to say about embracing globalization while really understanding the uniqueness of Indian universities with their strengths and challenges that they face. We also heard the disparities that are inherent in our higher education system. And as Professor Raj said, that regulations should meet aspirations and expectations. How do you see this evolve as we move forward in a post-COVID world with the new education policy we have?
So I think we're having the discussion in a really transitional time. I think the business of COVID and even the responses that you got from audience that the online or virtual or digital education will have more impact. I have my reservations on that. I would like to just point out to everyone, like the person who spoke after me, I forget the name, very eloquently said, see, the university traditionally, and I don't see why it should change, and I don't see any model that will bring out that change, have been the driver of discoveries, drivers of ideas, drivers of creation, public opinion, drivers of everything in philosophy, psychology, economics. You trace anything that you think you respect intellectually, I would find the origin of that in the universities. And I'm not saying online education will destroy all that. I think we many times are missing the role of what Humboldt or Newman had given to university, a redefinition of university about 220 years back, that university, the research in university, creation of knowledge, bringing new ideas, putting substance onto them and taking them to society was given, this job was given to universities. And I don't think anybody's taken that job from university. So even your vaccine, one of the best vaccine is coming from a university called Oxford. I could just again relate to you with the vaccine. There are 150 vaccines which are in development, 30 are in phase 1 trial. You trace origin of any of the platform that we use, you'll always find there's a university involved, whether it's RNA vaccine or DNA vaccine or protein vaccine. And I can give you hundreds of examples in physics, monoclonal antibodies, or GPS, or relativity, whatever, all happens in university. That is not good. That ought not to change, and that is not going to change. And Raj has said something fleetingly, and I'll flesh that out. I think the research in university should remain a fundamental role. Unless you have an alternative system, which I don't see for miles any other system that will produce, that will drive your economy, that'll bring your, but look at where Nobel Prizes go. They don't go to private labs or private institutions. I think there's some confusion about virtual education at undergraduate level or a school level versus same education at the research level. So I'm not going to spend too much time. I think you can see the difference very easily. Regulator, I think I'll just take 2 points. One is the sustainability, somebody pointed out. That's going to be a serious issue. If online education, even at undergraduate level, matures, the way everybody and consensus seems to be, it will mature, especially in some subjects I've said it earlier, like law or management, or where you don't need labs and so on. If it actually matures, then the top university, let's say top 100 universities in the world, will they dilute, as it were? So because online education then can be given to very large number of people. There's a whole advantage of online education or virtual mode is that you can have a large client and do a good quality job. So that will end up the top universities, and I won't name them, you can take top 20, top 30, will end up teaching very large number, should end up teaching very large number of students. I'm not great, I've never understood the flip mode. Flip mode was there for a long time when MOOCs came in and all that. So let's not confuse with the flip mode. The mode is this: online education versus campus education. So I'll separate into two layers, undergraduate and postgraduate or research level. So to conclude this thought in my mind, that if you then Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or UCL or King's or all Yale, if they now start teaching, let's say for an example, management course to 5,000 students each institution, the pool of students who wish to do this, or the employer who will employ these people, will be same limited as they are. That we are not going to create more employers, as it were. So the pool of students from your catchment area is common. Pool of faculty where you hire people to expand your online education will be common. It will edge out, and hence sustainability is a very important point. So the top 100 might and should, if consensus that online education is good, it can be done, there's no problem with it, forget about the idea of university, forget about sports or classroom or social behavior, etc. Let's say online education. Then we have a problem. Then after top 200 university, the other university is going to find extremely difficult to financially find sustainability. And somewhere somebody has to figure out a model. What is going to happen? Nobody knows. We can make a lot of predictions, whether COVID will be with us for 2 years or 1 year, 1.5 years. My suspicion is that my final comment, brick and mortar universities are going to go nowhere. That's the way the research will be done. That's physicality of research will demand it. My fear is that if everything else matures, then those who can afford higher education and brick mortar will this will be accentuated in one corner. A very large number of people not will, but should be able to take quality education from top university. Now, if that happens, then the university will end up, and they are worrying about it, as they should. Does their brand gets diluted? If there are 5,000 people doing law LLM from Harvard tomorrow, and 2,000 from Oxford, and 5,000 from Cornell and Yale, you can see what might happen with the online education. This is not a fear. This doesn't worry. This should not worry anybody. If quality education can be disseminated by the digital mode, so be it. But everyone needs to settle down. Parents will need to settle down with this. Students will need to settle down with it. Employer will need to settle down with it.
Right.
We'll see the consequences.
Right. Thank you. I actually wanted to bring in Professor Priyam, but I have to get a quick reaction from Professor Rajkumar on the last comment Professor CHAUHAN made about the importance of research at universities. To fundamentally relook how it's done. And Professor CHAUHAN talked about the strong correlation between these prestigious academic prizes and award and the way higher education is oriented and structured and regulated. And we talked about STEM versus non-STEM. Professor Rajkumar, your thoughts before I go to Professor Priyam.
Well, there is no doubt about the fact that research institutions historically has been driven by public funding. And I don't think there is any doubt about it. But the only difference I would say, if you look at the United States, for example, is that, private institutions are all the time receiving public funding, and public institutions are receiving private funding. So in some ways, If you look at a UC Berkeley, for example, it's a large public institution, but it receives significant private funding in the form of philanthropists and donors and others contributing. And if you look at Harvard or Yale or Stanford, which are all large private universities, they receive significant public funding from the government as well. So one of the challenges which I have always felt is that the discrimination meted out to private institutions, the entire regulatory framework, which by the way has been challenged in the National Education Policy 2020, that very specific words have been used to ensure that there will be a treatment that has historically been meted out to private institutions, and they are put in equal footing on the basis of the character of the institutions, as opposed to whether it is public or private. In many ways, I believe universities are fundamentally public in character and public in nature. The fact that they were established through private funding or public funding is immaterial for them to remain public in character and are in the pursuit of common good.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. I wish to bring Professor Priyam now. Professor Priyam, you heard what the other speakers had to say. Let me add to that. You've of course seen the new education policy, and one of the objectives of the policy is to sort of dissolve the existing disciplinary silos in which things have existed for far too long in at least our Indian higher education space. What is your reaction on that? And if you can touch on what the other speakers just said. Professor Priyam.
So I begin by endorsing once again what Professor Rajkumar has said, that the mode of funding is not what creates a public university, or the university needs to engage in the public. For example, I would urge to Professor Rajkumar, for example, the university has been the site where the most important innovations in teacher education have happened. Dewey works at the University of Chicago. Dewey works at the University of Columbia. The teachers' school at the University of Columbia still leads with the most eminent education journals. Now, the other example that was taken by Professor Rajkumar, and of course referred to by Professor VIRANDER CHAUHAN in terms of the idea that he spoke about. Let's go back to Berkeley. Let's go back to Clark Kerr, who doesn't refer to Humboldt and Newman. The third idea on the university comes with Clark Kerr's most important uses of the university. And what does Clark Kerr do? He tells the President of the United States, sitting on the East Coast, who invited him to be the Secretary of State for Education, and he says, no, I need to be in my own university and think of my university. The University of California then builds up in what has been called by eminent academics of the university system, John Aubrey Douglas, as a regional flagship. And they build up an entire, what I would say, a hub and spoke model of differentiated institutions, smaller institutions that connect, and also build up to connecting with the larger idea of the public research university, the University of Berkeley. Now, I don't have the time to go into the details, but let me tell you that on invitation 2 years ago when I was speaking at the University of Berkeley, the maximum philanthropy, even from the regional tie, comes to the University of Berkeley. Now, what needs to be looked at here? The Berkeley, therefore, gets its money from the philanthropists, but builds itself as a regional flagship. And I think that's the sustainable model of the university. Lots of work done on the algorithms by the 1980s, the most eminent PhDs on artificial intelligence done by IIT Kanpur graduates were not being done at IIT Kanpur, but were being done at the University of California, Berkeley campus. So 17 Nobel laureates housed on campus, and the physical site is actually very relevant because undergraduate students are taught, albeit with teaching assistants, even by Nobel laureates. So the university as a physical site brings the great, the biggest, and the brightest. And that brings me to your question about breaking the silos. Breaking the silos is in the university is not an idea of unbundling the university as if it were a utility. It is not about restructuring the university as if you are restructuring a public sector undertaking. So the state's perennial concern about structural adjustment of the public university is not something that works. This is not a utility that needs to be unbundled by theories of labor productivity, but it is a public site, and it's a public site which has a very eminent physical dimension. I can tell you that Professor VIRANDER CHAUHAN talking through a screen about the bacteria and the virus, and an eminent social scientist, if they could build a cross matrix of the changes in Indian democracy, of third world democracies, with public inventions in mass public health with respect to the bacteria and with respect to the virus, would make for the most eminent contemporary lecture. The idea of the public university is to engage with those lectures. And I think the university will belittle itself were it to engage only with the idea of the binary saying, oh, are we distance? Oh, of course, we've always been this, we've always been that. And the LSE, for example, I was submitting my homeworks on the X space. I'm already accessing JSTOR. You add one more to it. Now, if the service sector industry is in crisis, like most other sectors are, agriculture is in crisis, manufacturing is in crisis, services sector is in crisis, the university cannot pick up one to say that I'm going to pick you up and piggyback on you because the venture capitalists are putting all their money there. The university needs to think in a perennial sense. It needs to think about agriculture. It needs to think about manufacturing, as Clark Kerr did at the University of California, Berkeley, when he wrote about the uses of the university. And I'll conclude by telling you that as Clark Kerr wrote, the University of California, Berkeley was also engaging with acute poverty in the town of Oakland, a small town. A big university, a global university, was concerned with the immediate and the local. And this brand that you see today, this great brand that you see today, is built by California being a regional flagship, a community embedded structure, a structure that responds to inequalities of the working class and the masses within the region. So you begin local and you become global. That's the vision that I look at for the public university. And for its long-term sustainability, I think that's the path to take: community engagement, embedment, and perennial commitment to the principles of knowledge.
Thank you very much, Professor PRIYAM. I noticed that Dr. David Malone has now joined us. I'm very glad that you were able to join us, Professor Malone. Let me quickly introduce you. Dr. David Malone is Rector of United Nations University in Japan. It's a pleasure to have you here. If you're ready, can I ask the question that I asked to all the speakers first?
By all means.
Wonderful. So we were talking about the policy and regulatory space and the governance mechanism in the context of higher education institutions. I wanted to get your initial reactions on how this might change the model of governance and the model of regulation of higher education during these exceptional circumstances we are going through. Dr. Malone.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And first of all, my apologies to all of you and those online for being late in joining you. And I'm honored to be with you. I think generalizing too much is unhelpful, actually. I think what one sees in Asia is individual country experiences, sometimes regional experiences. There are great disparities between regions in some Asian countries. Indians tend to think of India, but Indonesia is very similar, another country with a very large population. So I think the local context very much influences what is both desirable and possible. The possible is often defined by financial possibility, and one difficulty in Asia is that governments everywhere, pretty well, with the possible exception of China, have moved towards defunding universities while still wanting to control them. And that is pretty problematic. If you bring nothing to the table, why should you be milking these institutions for your own purposes? So I'd say this has been quite a widespread phenomenon in Asia. It was, I think, born of the hope that it would be possible for university systems, by internationalizing themselves, to raise a lot of loot. but actually the loot never fully materialized. So what these university systems were stuck with was regulatory overdrive by bureaucrats who didn't know much about higher education, and politicians who often weren't very sympathetic to higher education, because contestation tends to come out of universities, and politicians don't like contestation by and large, unless they happen to be in the opposition. So these various factors having to do with money on the one hand, which is a powerful incentive, both positively and negatively in the higher education sector, wishful thinking by politicians and bureaucrats, excessive ambitions of control on university systems, which, as the last speaker, Manisha, was pointing out, pretty good at what they do left to their own devices. They do their best in most cases with the resources they have available to them. For all of these reasons, I think in the Asian setting, it's a sector not so much in crisis as in difficulty.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malone. We have 15 minutes left, and I want to spend the next 5 minutes on another question, which I feel is very important and an integral part of the session topic, the idea of sustainability. And I would request everyone to be a bit brief in their response. We heard Professor Chauhan saying that sustainability will be a very serious issue, particularly in certain subjects, in certain disciplines. I want to come back to you, Professor Chauhan. How do you interpret the term sustainability first, in light of all the pressing problems, not just medical and public health related? What's your idea of sustainability?
So I'll just not focus my answer. I'll take just 1 minute. I'm not going to see what is happening in America or UK or Germany. I'll just bring ourselves back to India. Very complex structure, huge number of new institutions. If their sustainability was beginning to be under pressure even without COVID, now, I see this in the private sector, as so-called private sector, more than I see in public sector, but tensions are in both, that if the fundings are reduced, which might be, I hope it doesn't, then I think that sustainability is physical sustainability. Just not being able to run your business, as it were, is going to be a problem. Lesser student, if you provide online education in a private sector, you probably won't be able to charge the kind of money that you were charging. And this is certainly true of American university, or parents will have to figure out whether if you go to LSE or to Imperial College, but everything is done online, whether the clientele would agree to do that. And if they're cheaper, then I think just financial sustainability of this university will be under doubt. I'll just leave it here because you have only 5 minutes. You need to get in.
Thank you, Professor Chauhan. I want to come to Professor Kumar now, just on the idea of sustainability.
Ashish, I'm going to give my time to David. David missed most of it, so no need to ask me anything. Please move to David.
Great, thank you. Dr. Malone, you heard what Professor Chauhan had to say about the idea of sustainability. I know you are close to completing your book, a handbook on higher education in the Asia Pacific region, which at least I'm very much looking forward to reading. Let me add another dimension to sustainability. There are concerns emerging in different parts of the world regarding budgetary cuts in certain disciplines in universities. What's your idea of sustainability, perhaps in the context of Asia Pacific?
Well, in a sense, I would surprise you by, in a way, changing the subject. Whenever you mention sustainability, I think of environmental sustainability. And I think while universities have talked a good game on the importance of environmental sustainability, they haven't done much to advance it. And I would like to see universities in Asia and elsewhere in the world do more to advance the saliency of environmental sustainability everywhere? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Professor Priyam, what's your idea of sustainability? How do you interpret it in light of these fast-moving tech changes in higher education?
So I'd like you to, once again, go slow. And I started with the idea of university sustainability, and that's how I interpreted policy and regulation. Now I'm going to take you down to an important public university within this country that I was able to see almost after having spent 30 years of my life engaging in higher education and studying at the LSE and whatever. And this is called the University of Kolapur in Maharashtra, right? Now this is a land grant university with 900 acres given by Raja Shahuji Bhosle. This is also the place where Dr. Ambedkar, the founding architect of our constitution, was invited by Shahuji on a dinner table. And this was like that important Socrates dinner where lots of dialogues happened. And Dr. Ambedkar advised him that an important thing for you to do would be to invest your resources in creating a public university. Now, this was a 900-acre land grant university in comparison to the London School of Economics, which had started as a grant to the Fabian socialists from a bookstore. And what were the ideas that were being perennially spoken about in these two universities spread across continents, divided by thousands of kilometers? The idea that egalitarianism, democracy need to be housed within a university. And just as LSE housed Karl Popper, who was an emigrant from Germany, the Kolapur University today, I'm proud to tell you, when I visited there last year, they were talking about, when I spoke to them about certain global ideas, they asked me one question: do you know, we have faced floods for the first time, disastrous climate change. Now, these are daughters of agricultural farmers, and I'm proud to say that India today has advanced to the level that the lowest socioeconomic strata is a participant in physical sites of public university. Now, the best writings in sociology, Tony Giddens at the London School of Economics, it's translated in Marathi and taught at the campus. For me, the question today of the sustainability of the public university in the idea, as an idea and as a practice in India, is environmental, but it's completely locally embedded. For me, the question is, why in large parts of North India, after Mahadevi Verma, I find no university, forget scientists, no university, producing a poet laureate in Hindi. So can you understand that the disaster that we are facing, the crisis that we are facing, is not a crisis of governance, is not a crisis of regulation, and least of all, it is not about public or private funding. It's about the fact that knowledge, the engagement with the counterfactual, and the fact that a poet laureate, as much as a heretic scholar, as much as a scientist pursuing a bacteria or a virus or simply bones across continents and HMS Beagle, could be housed within Indian universities. I think the biggest question mark is, why is the university not producing its poetry? And why is it that the best Indian scientists cannot be speakers across the land? Why is it that you cannot have Professor VIRANDER CHAUHAN go across to a University of Kolapur and engage with them in their problems? So I think the problems are not just distance. The problems are also about the fact that the university needs to respond to agrarian crisis in a large scale, especially in north and western parts of India. The university needs to respond to the crisis that is a crisis of the everyday, its quotidian formats. And the more we respond to the everyday and quotidian format challenges and crises, the more perennial the idea of the university will become. And I congratulate Professor Rajkumar. Last time when I visited your campus, he told me that the university is engaged in teacher education in all of Haryana. So there are ways in which you could be global and simultaneously you could be embedded, completely local, and give small solutions to what you think are frontline problems that the community outside faces with. And those problems can be responded in modes that are digital, blended. That's not the future of the university. The future of the university is in looking at it as a sustainable idea in community embedment and embedded engagement. It's about the relevance of the university. The guy right outside the doors of the university must be able to say that, yes, this is the university that responds to my problems. I'll conclude by telling you that the Banaras Hindu University, if you go to their gates, you will find long queues of people. And the two institutions within Banaras Hindu University that the community looks at is the School of Medical Sciences and the School of Agriculture. So I think we need to understand why university is relevant in local spheres, in its land grants, but also in its perennial engagement to knowledge.
Thank you, Professor Priyam. I'm glad you ended on that note because it touches on the first audience question we've got, and I would like to get Dr. Malone's response to the following question. The question is, how can we ensure an inclusive university governance and broad-based partnership approach by bringing in, let's say, the civil society in different communities during this time of crisis? Dr. Malone, your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a very good question because there is nothing preventing universities from adopting a broad-based approach to their own governance, but it tends not to happen particularly. So in some countries, you get certain actors in society or certain categories of actors in society being represented amongst the professorate, at board level of the university and so on. But whether this actually achieves inclusivity and sensitivity to the concerns of society around us, I'm not sure it always follows directly. So I think there are mechanical approaches to inclusivity, which are superficially convincing. You have something to point to, but the results of what you're pointing to may not be particularly convincing over time.
Thank you, Dr. Malone. If there are no comments on what was just said by Dr. Malone, I can ask the next question, which is to Professor Chauhan. The question is, while regulations have to be flexible, where do we draw the line? What are the things that should remain intact to allow the quality of education in a country like India?
So this, my comment was extremely in the context of how regulations or over-regulation or under-regulation has happened in India. And that's why you keep hearing that new education policy has come out after 34 years of the new national policy. So since I have experience of having worked at University Grants Commission and involved with, so when the system expanded the way it had expanded, especially after 2004, 2005, 6 kind of university and so on, see the old system of governance in which we are embedded. I mean, we still have mentally sort of controlling we know, a bunch of people know what is the quality, therefore we should disseminate everybody the idea of quality, etc. I think the idea is quite mature in India, although all that we have said today, all of us, we must realize that education and health, if you want to make any improvement, these are small steps, small and firm steps have to be taken. Nothing will happen overnight. We can wish and talk and bring ideas of all kinds from everywhere, from Berkeley or Harvard or Kolapur. Changes necessary will happen slowly, but it must go in the right direction. So the regulator, if you look at any regulation, I'll give you a very simple, very quick example. Historically, we had councils which were advising what to be done in a certain area: nursing council, pharmacy council, dentistry council, architectural council. So after so many years, we are saying that you don't need today, you're mature, universities are mature. I think we have to trust the university and academia, and I have not seen any reason to believe that university, good meaning university, can't handle what they want to do. So I don't think that when I said how far deregulation go, of course if the government money goes, or even if government money doesn't go or go in public sector, you have to keep an eye on the quality. And notion of quality will be contextual, will be locational, what you can provide in a small college versus what you can provide in Jindal University, all these things. I deal with this on daily basis in the National Accreditation Assessment Council. what do you deregulate? What do you judge your university on? What should be the idea of quality? So I would say first, in India, thank God we are talking about it, that we don't need over-regulation. I think we'll just stay with this in this country. Anything that we have over-regulated, I think we should try to slowly dismantle. But do not forget that again, it is the job of government or government agency to keep an eye on quality, keep an eye on equity with access, keep in quality. Those who want higher education should be able to access higher education, whether in this sector or that sector. I think, so initially I would deregulate. I go towards autonomy to the university, trust more academia. Academia must respond to that trust. I think that's the way to go in India. And this very contextual answer in the framework of Indian university right now. Highly expect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chauhan. I have time for one last question, which I would first open to to Professor Priyam, but anyone else can address that subsequently. Given what you said in the context of sustainability, how will STEM and non-STEM disciplines be affected differently in post-NEP in India? Professor Priyam.
So again, the question is just so much put into silos that the person who's formed the question needs to be told that the university will answer every question on principles of knowledge, and STEM and non-STEM are, these divisions are made by these receiving countries, where we have now started exporting our students as potential labor to their universities. Now for us, disciplines are not STEM and non-STEM. Karl Popper was a philosopher of science. So I think for us, the important thing is creating that model of the university where the sciences and the liberal arts can be taught together. The distinctions between STEM and non-STEM are not for real. And those who ask these questions must be set on an imaginary trail. And that should be the first job of the digital university, which ASHISH is advocating so strongly, and his posters are advocating so strongly. Put your university people on a voyage across HMS Beagle. Tell them to sail across continents and see the flora, fauna, and people, whether they want to use the lenses of biology or the sciences or geography of the tectonic plates or of the comparative social sciences, which now uses large-scale data. So if you come back to a university person, the answers are going to be based on principles of knowledge. And as far as the new education policy is concerned, I do think that the new education policy is talking about the idea of a liberal university where the core is going to be the principles of knowledge. The engagement with the science and the social sciences are not silos. That was your last question. They are dealt with in togetherness. The best methodologies do not belong to the science, do not belong to the social sciences. They respond to the human condition. The post-World War consensus on the idea of the public university is that the university must first and foremost, as Rajkumar has said, whether funded publicly or privately, must respond to the human condition. Even calling it common good is not good enough. And remember that crises such as the corona have come to us because we had less faith in our virologists sitting in their labs. We thought they were Looney Tunes doing some research which is not accountability. No. Let them research to the extent that we don't understand what they're doing, but they come out with an answer to something 200 years down the line. That's the faith and that's the autonomy that we need to rebuild as much for our scientists as we need to do for our social scientists. And lastly, there must be poetry coming out of Indian universities. You cannot tell me, in staff rooms at Delhi University, for example, I have seen after colleges shut down, lecturers will sit down and say, oh, let's read poetry, let's write poetry. Why is their regular scheduled work not poetry? Why is not their regular scheduled work the prose for the world and for the community? That's my plea to the university.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any comments? We have run out of time, but anyone has any comments? Anything to add?
A quick comment. The last question, I can see where the question is coming from. the Indian higher education system, I use a very crude word, probably got hijacked into creation of a lot of mono-subject universities, whether it's the national law schools, whether it is the IITs or NITs or even ISERs. So this has gone on for a very long time.
Yeah.
And new education policy, fortunately, highly stresses on this. The universities have to be hugely multidisciplinary university. It won't happen tomorrow, but the directions have been given. And that's the STEM or non-STEM really comes up because we put them into different verticals.
Exactly. Thank you, sir.
And that needs to disappear, but it won't happen. I mean, even if all of us are running this country and higher education and all the money, it can't happen tomorrow. But this direction is absolutely necessary to go forward to. That IIT is not going to produce a chemical engineer, or JNU is not going to produce only a historian and so on. This just has to change.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. It was a wonderful thought to end this panel discussion on interdisciplinarity, and we need to be patient for it to happen in a country like India. Thank you very much.
Just a minute, this is Ashish. I just want to say, since David, I came a bit late, I have a question for David. David, since you are part of the United Nations University, I want to ask you a question. What is the role of the United Nations University in connecting with the world of universities? Because a lot of people who may be watching this program in different parts of the world may not even be familiar with the role of the UNU. But the key question is, how does the UNU shape the relationship between the world of universities, where some of the issues that we talked about becomes the larger, part of institutional imagination in these countries and societies?
Great, Raj. Well, listen, I think you assume that we do influence the world of universities, and I'm not convinced that's the case at all. We're quite a small institution. We have 12 locations throughout the world on 5 continents, working on fairly narrow subject areas. For example, the management of natural resources in Ghana, in Accra in Ghana, or development economics in Helsinki, Finland. So these are rather narrow areas. I'd say our intellectual framework has always been to try to be of service to the objectives of developing societies, what matters in developing countries. In countries like Canada, the US, Australia, they don't need a UN university or anything like it. Developing countries are still in many cases actively figuring out or trying to figure out what should be their priorities. And there, I think in a very modest way, taking advantage of the US platform, a UN university can make a contribution. But again, we need to bear in mind it's a very modest contribution overall.
Thank you very much to all the distinguished panelists. Thank you, Dr. David Malone, Professor Virender Chauhan, Professor Manisha, PRIYAM, and of course, my colleague, ASHISH Bharadwaj, for being part of the session. I deeply appreciate the time that you gave, and this session is now ended. Thank you very much.